And I'm happy to welcome you to this Beyond the Headlines event featuring Dambisa Moyo, international economist and author of Winner Takes All, China's Race for Resources and What It Means for the World. As that title, Winner Takes All, implies, Dambisa Moyo is someone with strong views. And as a reading of her book proves, she is someone who puts forth urgent and uncompromisingly stated arguments to support those views. This should come as no surprise to anyone familiar with her previous two books. She thrives on confronting conventional wisdom. She pretty much shocked the developed world in 2009 with her first book, Dead Aid: Why Aid is Not Working and How There is a Better Way for Africa. And she returned last year with How the West Was Lost, 40 years of economic folly and the stark choices that lie ahead. Dead Aid resonated particularly in this development-minded community, since it was an indictment of traditional aid to Africa, which she contended had fostered dependency, encouraged corruption, and ultimately perpetuated poor government and poverty. Critics argued back that she had shortchanged accomplishments of aid. Dambisa speaks with added authority about Africa since she was born and raised in Zambia. And she writes with the intellectual heft of someone who earned master's degrees at Harvard, an American university, and a doctorate in economics at Oxford. It was in Zambia in June 2011 that Hillary Clinton famously cautioned that Africa must be beware of what she called a new colonialism, threatening the continent. Clinton said, "We saw that during colonial times, it is easy to come in, take out natural resources, pay off leaders, and leave." She didn't say China, but she didn't have to, because everyone knew who she was talking about. In Winner Takes All, Dambisa takes on Clinton's claim in her own characteristically direct manner. She writes, "To say that Africa is being recolonized, as is often proclaimed, or that the average African is not benefiting is just plain false." The background for her book is the hugely ambitious program that China has embarked on domestically and internationally to meet the economic and development ambitions that exceed even its own vast resources. Dambisa bases her case on the commodity dynamics that the world will face over the next several decades, focusing in particular on the implications of this aggressive Chinese global rush for resources at a time when demand for access to basic commodities like water, arable land, minerals, and oil may produce cutthroat rivalries and leave the slow-footed behind and bereft. Shortages in the commodities market, she says, have the potential to affect dramatically the way that all of us live. While she believes in free markets, she once was a banker for Goldman Sachs. She also respects the power and influence of state-led capitalism. And the tone of her closing argument is that the West better watch out. She writes, "When the day of reckoning comes in the form of resource scarcity, as it almost certainly will, sooner rather than later, who will be ready, stocked up with inventories, saved up for the rainy day?" For the answer to that question and many other compelling ones raised in Winner Take All, I am happy to turn the floor over to the distinguished author, Dambisa Moyo.
Thank you very much, Warren, and thank you very much to the IPI for hosting me this evening. One of the problems with sitting around and hearing somebody do an introduction, it very much sounds like you're attending your own wake. So I have to say it's a very bizarre thing. But in any case, I'm very much hoping that we'll have an opportunity to have more of a discussion about some of the big issues that I think are evolving around the world. But obviously, in particular, we're here to discuss commodities. In order to do that, I thought I would give a backdrop or sort of a macro perspective, macro picture of where the commodity story is today, and then we can drill down to specifically what China is doing and why it is that China is doing what she's doing, which it is very systematic but also very aggressive. And then finally, we can spend some time talking about, shall we say, the more controversial issues, everything from the accusations of neocolonialism, slave labor, the use of sort of more corrupt approaches in investments across the world. But I would leave that to the end, and perhaps, and I imagine that during Q&A that will sort of come out quite a bit. But before we sort of dive in, I'd like to just throw out a couple of statistics, a couple of things that I hope will form the backdrop as you come along with me on this journey to talk about where the commodity story is today and where I think it might go in the years to come. So first of all, I want to remind the room that of the 7 billion plus people that are on the planet today, something like almost 90%, about 88 to 90% of the population lives in the emerging world. And I think this is very important because when I travel, and I've been very fortunate to travel to over 50 countries around the world, one of the most common refrains that seems to be gaining a lot of momentum is that there's actually a tension, a competition that is going on between the number one economy, which is the United States, with about $14 trillion in GDP, we know has democratic process, democracy as its main political structure. And we also know that has private capitalism as its main driver or its economic ethos. On the other side, you have the second largest economy with around $7 trillion as China, with no democracy and also with state capitalism as its main economic impetus. Two important things jump out from the situation as I've just painted it for you today. One is that by most forecasts, economic forecasts, China will become the largest economy in the world by at the latest 2020. I mean, I've seen some quite aggressive forecasts that put that more around 2015. So just a few years away from now, it will be the largest and leading economy in terms of GDP. Not GDP per capita, but GDP. But the other point that I think is even more poignant as we go through what China's doing and how she's doing it, is that these two economies, the United States and China, have the same Gini coefficient, which is a measure of income inequality. So one is democratic with private capitalism, the other one is non-democratic with state capitalism, and they have the same number or same ratio in terms of income inequality. I started off by saying to you that 90% of the world's population lives in the emerging world. From the perspective of the emerging world, if I may speak on behalf of over 5 billion people, they're looking at this and saying, who or which model should we pursue? For over 50 years, many countries, not all, but many countries have leaned towards the American model, Western model of economic development and political infrastructure. However, in terms of delivery of the reduction of poverty and also sustainable economic growth, clearly the Chinese story has some appeal. And as I said, in terms of thinking about the commodity problems, which is why we're here to talk today, I think this is an important thing to bear in mind. Specifically in terms of commodities, let me start by saying two things. Since 2009, so in the aftermath of the financial crisis, we have seen commodity prices rise by over 150%. In just this past month, and largely driven by the drought in the United States this year, we've seen commodity prices rise by over 10% in some months, month to month. So, and in fact, if many of you may be aware, commodity prices have now come back onto the fore in terms of the risks of hunger, malnutrition, commodity price spikes, and what that might mean for more increased conflict. And specifically with regards to conflict, my second point is that since 1990, there have been around 20 wars, over 20 wars, which I've listed in the book, that have been raging around the world that have their origins in commodities. So we have a two-pronged problem. We have commodity prices rising quite considerably, which obviously, as the prices go up, it deteriorates or worsens people's living standards. But we also have increased risk of conflict. I will point, for example, to a recent report which came out in February this year from the US government, looking specifically at the risk of water wars because of the shortages of water around the world. And I will give some examples of some of the things that China is doing specifically in water, but also in other commodities. So set against this backdrop, the risk of higher commodity prices and of higher or more conflict, I set out to go and write this book, Winner Take All, to try and find out, first of all, what was going on more globally in terms of commodities, but then specifically to drill down to what the China story was in particular, and how it was and why it was that China was becoming so popular in the commodity space. And I'd like to share some of those thoughts with you. So as Warren mentioned, I'm an economist by training. My PhD is in economics. And so I'm sorry, but I will be focusing a lot on the economic story of demand and supply as a starting point. So there are three key drivers that are really driving the demand story around commodities. The first one is the population. So I mentioned that we are now at about over 7 billion people. In places like India, the population is growing at 1 million people a month. The world population is growing at about 80 million people every year. By some estimates, that's the size of Germany every year is being added in. I come from a small country, so you can imagine that this is quite considerable. My population is just 13 million. I often joke that when I travel to China, 13 million is not even a real city in China. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. But just to set this into context, we are living in a very, very unique time in the history and the prehistory of the world in terms of where the world has come from, but also in terms of where the world is going. And this is why this book does not discount some of the earlier concerns that have been raised for everywhere from Malthus in 1798 to the Club of Rome back in 1970, but also the literature like from MIT around limits to economic growth. There have been many other people who have written around the issue of commodity scarcity, but we've obviously been bailed out because population was not growing as rapidly as it has grown since the 1950s. So we've seen population in the world go from around 3 billion in the 1950s to the population where we are today, 7 billion. We expect, demographers expect, I should say, that the world's population will continue to grow, plateauing out in 2100 around 10 billion people. And I again want to really emphasize that this is a very, very unique point in time. The expectation is after 2100, we will not ever see the scale or the speed of population growth that we're witnessing today. So population growth is a key driver of the story. We have many more people drawing on fewer resources because we are talking here, of course, about scarce, finite, and depleting resources. And I will come to the supply side picture in a moment, but for now, number one is increasing population. The second key aspect of the demand story is wealth. We all know that we are witnessing also an increase in the amount of wealth that is occurring around the world. So by some estimates, we expect that by 2030, which again is not too far away from now, we will see an additional 3 billion people living in the middle class, many of them coming from the emerging markets, as I pointed out to you. That's where the story is incredibly compelling. On the one hand, it's a great story because we are now seeing improvements in livelihood of people around the world. On the other hand, this is a considerable draw on every part of the commodity spectrum, from land and water to minerals and to energy. But again, I will drill down specifically so you have a good handle on the numbers that I'm talking about. Looking at maps today, we will see the largest spikes in global wealth. We'll continue to see that in Asia, but places like Africa and South America are also expected to see considerable improvements in global wealth. If you look at the global forecast for GDP for this year alone, from the IMF that just came out in July, Africa will be the third fastest growing region after China and India over the next 2 years. And that obviously is good news for Africans, but also for the world in general. But you can imagine that places considerable pressure and a big contributor to the 3 billion, but a considerable pressure on natural resources. The third key element, which tends not to be discussed very much, is urbanization. And if you go around the emerging world, whether it's to Mexico City or to Sao Paulo or to any of the big metropoles in Asia, you'll know what I'm talking about. One of the biggest aspects of policy making in the emerging markets is actually to get people to live in the urban areas so that they can better deliver public goods such as education and healthcare and of course, infrastructure. I have some statistics here. These are 2001 statistics. First of all, we're talking right now about we have around 3 billion people living in urban areas. By 2030, there'll be 5 billion people living in urban areas. I mean, the majority of the world's population will be living in urban areas. There are 9 cities in the United States that have a population of at least 1 million residents. I can read them up as many of you will be familiar with them. Of course, New York, number 1, 8.2. Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Philadelphia, Phoenix, San Antonio, San Diego, and Dallas. European Union has 18 cities. I'm not going to read them off, but European Union has 18. China today has 93. 93 cities with 1 million people each. It is a key aspect of their policy to increase their urbanization for obvious reasons. The expectation is that they will have around 200 cities by 2020, and very, very deliberate policies. And of course, if you read their 5-year plan, they are very explicit about this. But by 2020, they expect that there'll be about 200 cities with 1 million people each. And they will have as many as 6 cities which will have 10 million people each. So that's the population of Zambia. And they'll have 10 cities like that. So that is the demand picture. So population growth, we have the story of increasing wealth, which will change people's eating habits. We all want to have mobile phones. Just in terms of mobile phones specifically, there are already over 5 billion mobile phones on the planet. The expectation is that in places like Africa, where 60% of the population, if you look at mobile phone penetration, 60% of Africans have mobile phones. The expectation is that it won't be too long, probably in the next decade, that everyone in Africa will have access to some form of mobile telephony. There are already around 20 countries in the world where people have more than one mobile phone. I'm guilty of that. You have sort of a private and a business phone. The United States, but across much of Europe, people already have more than one mobile phone. 20 countries are in that situation. So those are the 3 demand drivers. Again, population, wealth increases, and urbanization. I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you about the other side of the equation, which is the supply side of the equation. And on the supply side, I'm going to talk about 4 categories: land, water, energy, and minerals. And we can drill down further to give some examples, more specific examples during Q&A or when we have a bit more time. So let's start off with land. First of all, one of my favorite statistics is that Africa today has more untilled arable land than anywhere else in the world. And again, if you think about this, and we'll come to why China is doing what she's doing, it's pretty obvious why China is in Africa, because in terms of China's situation, she has about 1.3 billion people, more people than in Africa, more poor people than there are in Africa. China's got 1 billion people who live in incredibly dire economic circumstances, but only has 7% arable land. So a lot of the land that is not used to build cities, which we build cities on arable land, or used for farming, is pretty much too arid or too difficult to grow crops in. So China, 1.3 billion people, 7% arable land. Africa has the most untilled arable land left in the planet. More generally, only 11% of land on the earth today is arable. And if you look at the population growth that I mentioned to you earlier, the big concern is that there will be many more people fighting for, demanding, or trying to live on fewer acres of arable land. So that is a big story around the arable land, pressure for increased arable land. If you turn to water, 70% of the earth is water. And by the way, I should have said earlier on that when I started writing this book, I knew nothing about commodities. And I say that because, yes, I drink water, and yes, I put gas in a car. But in terms of actually understanding some of the constraints that we are facing or will be facing in the world, I was quite naive. So these are some of the statistics that I found when I was going through it and doing my research that I found was very surprising. One of them was water. 70% of the earth is water, but less than 1% is actually water that we can use even to clean our toilets. Less than 1%. Most of the other water is too salty for use. Again, I will save you in a moment. I'll explain to you what China is doing around this. But if you think about it, One of the big problems around policy making is that in a place like the United States, we don't really think about a water shortages or scarcity, except maybe if you're in California. You switch on your tap, you don't think twice that water might not come out. In many places around the emerging world, places like India, for example, but also in parts of Africa and South America, people are already facing very acute water shortages. And as I mentioned, the U.S., I really encourage you to get your hands on the report that came out from the U.S. National Security Office in February of this year, talking about forecasting where they think that the water conflicts will be. It's very interesting, and concerns around people using water as a tool for terrorism. It's a very, very interesting report. You should get your hands on it. But in any case, 70% of the earth is water, less than 1% fresh and easily accessible. If you turn to energy, this is a story that we spend a lot of time on, and I guess during Q&A we'll come to whether we're going to get a reprieve with shale gas and all that. We can talk about that. But for now, I will say to you that since 1980, we have actually been consuming more than the amount of energy that has actually been found. Let me give you one of my favorite examples is the discovery of oil offshore Brazil. There's what they call the Tupi oil fields, TUPI. Lots of euphoria around this. So they had found 123 billion barrels of oil, and it would have considerably altered the path of energy dependency around the world. In fact, the commodity price of oil came down when this announcement came out because they thought that the world was going to be supplied with excess oil. It was about 3 months later, the government came out and said that the oil that they had discovered with a small d was actually sitting below 2 miles of salt in the waterbed. And even today, in 2012, we simply do not have the technology and the ability to drill down through that salt to get access to the oil. So both in terms of cost and in terms of technology, it was actually not accessible. Oil today is trading around closer to $100 then, and frankly, I don't think it will ever be near $20 that we've seen over the last several decades. Many more stories to come on oil. Minerals, the one commodity that China does not have, and most important in terms of her scarcity, is copper. Pretty much everything else China does have, and as I'm sure many of you in this room know, in fact, China has 98% of the world's production of what we call rare earths. So these are minerals that are incredibly rare that are found in things like mobile phones. The United States and the European Union earlier this year, I think it was March this year, actually have sued the Chinese government because the Chinese put a ban on exporting those minerals in particular. But the fact of the matter is copper is the one commodity that China is desperately short. And if you speak to commodity traders, they'll tell you already that the price, even though it's in a public market, the price of copper and coal actually are both significantly influenced by what China is doing in terms of moving the price. So countries like my own country, Zambia, Congo DRC, Chile, and a number of countries in Eastern Europe are very big hotbeds of Chinese admiration and love because the Chinese are desperate for copper, which is one of the big things that we produce. So now that I've suitably depressed you, I just want to drill down a little bit on what's going on in China specifically. And I've already told you some of this stuff, but I just want to give you a bit more color in terms of what's happening in China. So the Chinese population, first of all, is about 1.3. Expectation is that it's going to plateau down to plateau out at 1.4 billion over the next decade. So actually by 2020, we will see a flattening out to about 1.4 billion. And if you start, if you heard of discussions of China versus India, this is one of the big debates. A lot of people say it's better to bet on India because India has a continuing growing population, whereas China will have a lot of the problems that many of the Western economies are facing today, where they have a sort of a slowdown in the young population, and therefore it'll be difficult to sustain longer-term economic growth. That being said, even if their population stopped growing today, the fact of the matter is that they've got a stock of people, 1.4 billion people, where in the next decades to come, I would say at least 2 decades, there will still be significant pressures in terms of how they live and where they live. I am going to pass around this picture, if that's okay. Let me just see if I can walk with this. Can I just pass this to you? just as a picture that I found of a Chinese rail station. It's a picture of how urbanized the place has become. I should have actually made more pictures, but it'll make its way around. Just a snapshot picture of some of the pressures. But again, I'm sure people who've been to China will know what I'm talking about in terms of population growth and the population pressures that they're facing. So that's the population story, 1.4 billion, today about 1.3, significant pressure on commodities. Wealth, was a second point. We know that China's GDP has come down. It's bottomed out, I should say, at 7.6 at the last print. I actually think that it's probably bottomed out. I saw something by President Hu Jintao saying that he's still concerned that there are downside risks to that number. I think setting that aside, the fact of the matter is that they now have 300 million people that, quote unquote, live like us, Western standards of living. It's a political imperative for them. They will have to continue to deliver improvements in economic growth and in wealth in order to keep their population at bay. Just in terms of numbers, you will also know that China was the largest economy back in 1820. If you look at Angus Madison's data in the world, they made a number of catastrophic errors, which cost them many decades. However, in just the past 30 years, again, nothing you haven't heard before, China has gone from being nowhere, really, to being the second largest economy, with prospects to being the first in the next decade. But also, it comes considerably down. Now it's around number 100 in terms of per capita income, on the global scale. Wealth continues to improve. The art of state capitalism means that it actually has a better chance, some would argue, and I think there's a story there, in terms of improving many more lives across the board, even though today the Gini coefficient, which is that measure of income inequality I mentioned to you, is the same as the United States. Growth is likely to slow. We do expect that growth will plateau out over the long term. I think probably no more than 5% out into 2030. But for now, I think that it's pretty clear that they still have a strong desire to improve their wealth statistics. Just a couple of other things. In terms of consumption as a share of GDP, the Chinese consumption as share of GDP is around 35%, compared to the United States, which is around 70% consumption share of GDP. Most people would say those are two extremes. The sort of goal is probably somewhere in the middle. It should probably both be around 50%. But the fact of the matter is that increase, that shift towards more consumption means that there'll be more demand for cars, for mobile phones, for better quality food, meat, and so on, and therefore more pressure on commodities. Some statistics on urbanization was the third key driver of commodity demand. By 2025, these are government statistics from China. They expect that about 1 billion people, this is 2025, we're in 2012, 2025, so 12 years from now or so, 1 billion people will live in cities in China. They expect that the urban economy will basically represent 90% of their GDP. And as I mentioned to you, they'll have 220 cities with 1 million people each, and 23 with 5 million each, and around 10 with 10 million people each. Considerable issues and pressures around commodities there. I'm not going to spend too much more time talking about the urbanization story. I think that's quite clear. I mean, there's lots and lots of data and research, and we can talk about this some more if people are interested, that links increased urbanization and GDP. So the higher your GDP, the more urbanization, but then also lots of data on what that does for demand for different commodities. And there's a lot of this is in my book, but there's some fantastic research showing how the sensitivities, how much more meat is eaten in an economy because more people live in an urban area. But again, I won't dwell too much on that. Very quickly, supply constraints in China. We've talked about demand. I just want to say that I mentioned to you that copper is one of the big missing pieces in their story. On the food side, soybeans is the big story. I have some data here. In terms of consumption, China consumes 27% of the world's soybean consumption. She only produces 5%. In every other commodity, corn, wheat, sugar, China is able to satiate her demand. And this is a great story for the United States, actually, because the United States and Brazil are the biggest soybean producers in the world today. And so in terms of if you're a trader and you want to put your money somewhere, is a great place to put your cash in soybeans, because I actually believe that there will be continued pressure there, and China is simply not able to grow the crop herself. In terms of water, China is below the world average for water. One of the things that China has embarked upon, just to give you some flavor for some of the specific things that China is doing, she's actually not only been blowing up clouds to create water, which is a big story around the Beijing Olympics, but also she's been rerouting rivers. So the Brahmaputra River, for example, with India, has become a big point of contention as the Chinese government has gone in and started to try and move the river. But also trying to move rivers within the country. But obviously, beyond just within country considerations, there are also issues with China, which both Manmohan Singh and Hoge have talked about extensively, claiming that they'll sort it out, but issues still arise. Oil demand in China far outstrips supply. Just to, again, illustrate, we consume in the world 85 million barrels of oil every single day. The United States, with 310 million people, consumes about 20% of that energy. China, with 1.3 billion people, consumes about 10% of the world's energy. So just pause, don't have to be a great mathematician for this. If China started to consume, the average Chinese started to consume at the level of the United States, we simply cannot compete. We simply cannot satiate that demand. I mentioned to you already the copper story. Significant data is in the book, but there's lots of data around commodity shortages specific to copper in China, and how that might limit or actually cause more problems in countries that are very heavily dependent on copper. I'd like to just give you a few, just to bring the story to life. I want to give you a few examples of the sort of things that China is doing around the world. I've just given you the example of water, where she's going to countries like Brahmaputra River in India and actually rerouting a whole river. But just to give you a few other examples, in 2007, China bought a mountain in Peru, Mount Toromocho, which is actually half the height of Mount Everest. They spent about $3 billion to buy, it's about 2 tons of copper in this, not 2 tons, 2,000 tons of copper in this, did I get that right?
Yep, no, it's right in the beginning.
All right,
Yep.
in the book, you're looking at your nose, I wasn't sure.
It said copper mountain in Peru.
Okay, I was wondering what he was.
I was going to ask you about that.
Oh, okay, he was going to ask me. Okay, well, I spoiled it. Anyway, they bought this mountain, and I say they bought it. They actually bought the mineral rights to mine this copper mountain. If you calculate how much the value of that copper is today on the market, remember I said they paid about $3 billion for it. Some estimates say that it's probably more worth around $8 trillion. So vast sums of money going in onto these countries. Brazil is right next door to the United States here. China is now Brazil's largest foreign direct investor and largest trading partner. Same for places like Colombia. One of my all-time favorite stories is an African story. The distance from Cape to Cairo, so it's one of the southernmost points of Africa, to Cairo in Egypt, northernmost point of Africa, is about 3 times the distance of New York to California. It's about 9,000 miles. And that whole distance is now completely tarred. You can drive, it'll take you about 5 weeks, and you'll drive through 15 countries, but it's a completely tarred road. And if you drive through, there are these massive signs that say, a gift from the People's Republic of China. But this is already something that exists today. In terms of ongoing issues, and I know we're going to get into this, there's everything from the claims of neocolonialism, which I actually think are quite absurd. And I say that because I mentioned already that, if anything, the problem with the Chinese is not that they have this big agenda to politically take over these economies. If anything, they are too detached from what's going on in terms of the economy, in the host economies where they're investing. I had a meeting recently with a U.S. ambassador in a country which is a host country for resources. I won't expose him by saying who he was. But he said to me that the American engagement with China in these economies, so let's take Zambia or Brazil or wherever, is basically 3-pronged. they focus, ironically enough, on talking to the Chinese about democracy and governance, which I thought was farcical, but anyway, there we go. They focus on talking to them about economic investment and economic development. And they focus on talking to the Chinese about social investment, so things like education and healthcare. And this gentleman I was speaking to said that the Chinese ambassador told him categorically that they have absolutely no interest in number 1 or number 3. No interest in talking about governance issues or democracy. They said that is the purview or the responsibility of these sovereign states to get their heads around that. And they have absolutely no interest in sorting out healthcare and educational issues because ultimately they have their own problems at home. So the only thing they're really concerned about or interested in is economic investment. I actually think it's going to be very hard to sway them in another way. I'm not saying that it wouldn't be nice if things were smooth and transparent all the time, but I do think that to expect the Chinese to engage in these other aspects when they have such a large poor population themselves, I think is unreasonable. There are lots of concerns also, aside from neocolonialism, there's also lots of discussion about the use of slave labor. In the book, and I've talked about this also, I found it very hard, virtually impossible to find any evidence of slave labor as a systematic and deliberate approach or use by the Chinese, whether it's in Turkey or across Africa or Bangladesh, and there was a Sri Lankan professor who talked a lot about this. I couldn't find any evidence. And what I say quite cheekily in the book is that if we're living in a world of mobile phones, you would expect that people would be able to take pictures of this type of thing somewhere to provide evidence of this. I am not saying that the Chinese are perfect, and I'm not here to defend them or to speak only positively about them, but I think that one of the disservices that we do, or I think that the world gets trapped in, is making claims or charges that have no basis in fact or very hard to prove, where ultimately it causes much more friction and a schism between the Chinese and the rest of the world at a time when many countries in the world think that they need the Chinese, including the United States, because remember, China is the largest lender to the United States government. 70% of the world in the emerging markets in places like Africa, Middle East, South America, 70% of the population is under the age of 24. In places like Uganda, 50% of the population is under the age of 15. These countries need investment, they need job creation, they need it fast, otherwise they'll end up with an Arab Spring type thing where people are actually frustrated, less because of the lack of democracy, I would say, more because of the lack of improvement in their livelihoods. We can talk about environmental considerations. I think that there is a responsibility for us to hold governments accountable to deliver better outcomes, both in terms of labor and environmental concerns. But again, I think it's rather foolhardy to think that the Chinese will go to a third country and then start that they should be holding themselves accountable. I know that's something, an ideal that we should all aspire to, but I think that in reality, what we want is to have accountable governments who police and make sure that the Chinese behave in a proper way. Warren, why don't I stop there?
Yeah.
I mean, there's lots more to say, but I'm seeing you cross off stuff, so I want to make sure you don't cancel off all your questions.
There's a long list of things here.
Okay.
I'm just going to chat with.
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry.
Yeah. We're going to get to the audience here in a minute. I just have 2 or 3 things. Mainly they're just things that you talk about in the book that I wanted to kind of highlight. And one of them is the theme you were on the very end there about what people say about China's involvement abroad and what you think the truth is. One of the things they say, and in fact, when I've been in Africa, and this is not research, this is just journalism, I have been with Africans who have complained that the Chinese bring their own workers with them. Mm-hmm. You have a passage in the book where you acknowledge that's true, but then you go on to say that actually the Chinese do create lots of local jobs. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So yes, it is true. The Chinese do come with their own workers. There's a table in the book. I don't know what page it's on right now, but I think, is Kevin in here? Kevin, do you mind just having a quick look? There's a table in the book where we looked at a number of examples of projects, and we went to Africa because, again, I think for a whole host of reasons, Africa is the one continent where there is a lot more misinformation, I think, about what the Chinese are doing there. And I think it's quite unfair because these economies do need that investment very desperately. And so I think that there are better ways to get the Chinese to do the right thing than to sort of finger wag at them and sort of get them to leave. But what I've done is in the table we have collated, if I remember correctly, it's about 10 examples of projects, Chinese-led projects in Africa in about these 10 countries. It's data from different sources, some official, some non-official, some human rights organizations, so it's not just colored in one direction. And we found that actually in all instances, there were more Africans hired than there were Chinese. And what has tended to happen is that in the cases where there were a number of Chinese workers, a lot of them came with technical skills that perhaps were missing. Again, this is the argument. I mean, the Angolan project is an example of this, where the skills were actually not available in Angola, and so they brought in foreign workers. Please do not misunderstand me. I am not saying that there's no issue around bringing foreign workers into an economy. But I do think that to say the sort of headline that the Chinese are bringing in foreign workers and putting Africans out of work, I think is far too simplistic. And this data that we collated for these 10 projects, it's a small sample, but I think it also illustrates that the issue is much more nuanced than these headlines, which are incredibly damaging for investment. And may I just also add to that, I know that often journalists go to Africa and they come back with a story saying, oh, I met X number of Africans and they're upset. And again, remember, I'm from Zambia. We've actually had a number of skirmishes in Zambia around the Chinese employment practices. But there's a great survey. The Pew Institute a few years ago put out a survey. Am I allowed to say that?
It's next on my list.
Oh, was it?
Keep going.
Sorry.
This is the 2007 survey? Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Go
okay, so the 2007, I'm so impressed you actually read the book, Warren. This is 2007, the Pew Institute went to, I believe it was around 10 African countries, everywhere from Ethiopia, Zambia, Ghana, and so on. And they actually asked the Africans, what do you think of the Chinese? Do you like them? Do you hate them? Are they better or worse than the Americans? And consistently, by wide margins, I'm talking like 97%, 98%, the Africans that were surveyed said, we love the Chinese. We think they're improving our livelihoods. They are changing our lives for the better. And actually, we prefer them to the Americans. And I say that not to say that we don't want the Americans and that kind of thing. That's absolutely not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is that the story here is not the way it's painted. I mean, I have not yet seen a positive story around what the Chinese are doing in Africa or anywhere around the world in any of the Western press. I mean, it always is laced with a point of abuse or exploitation. And I think it's incredibly damaging for the long-term prospects of economic growth and job creation.
You mentioned in passing shale gas.
Yeah.
And in the book, you pretty much say you don't think shale gas is the salvation that is being put forth by people. Can you just say that? Just
I think
about that a second?
For two reasons. One is the more obvious one, which is just environmental concerns. I mean, there's a lot of pushback now, and I'll put in a number of studies and polls that have been taken in amongst American populations in the Marcellus Shale sector here on the eastern board. And it's not going, I mean, it may actually end up happening, but I think it's not going to be as plain sailing or a fait accompli in terms of swaying the American public that this, shale is the way to go. And that you might say, okay, is more of a policy wonk issue. The bigger issue, I think, is that the costs of actually production of shale are, and by the way, the benefits are actually not as positive as we would think. So in other words, it's much more costly in terms of toxins, in terms of the cost of subsidence and moving the earth. But also in terms of the benefits, I put in a number of examples from the US government itself where the revisions to the amount of energy that we can get from these shale explorations is considerably scaled back after, again, this big euphoria. We're going to be energy independent. So it's really to say it's a wait and see more than anything. But I do think that in the interim, we should not be as optimistic or as sanguine as I think sometimes it's pitched. And I also, just the last thing I would say on shale, is that the United States is by far the leading country in this space. And so if there were a way to crack it, and I wish also the United States would focus on desalination, and right now China and Saudi Arabia are the leaders on that. But I think the broader problem is a lot of the energy demands that are coming up, places like China and so on, will not be met by shale because shale, in fact, they're focusing on nuclear
Desalination.
Desalination. I saw that. Okay, sorry about that.
No, not at all. I was hoping you would talk about it. So
okay, well there you go. Anyway, so I think again, I don't want to sound sort of negative and say, like a negative Nelly and say it's never going to happen. But I do not believe the United States will be energy independent in the next 10 years. Mm-hmm. That's my sense.
I'm going to do one last question. I'm going fast here because Dambisa has to leave a little sooner than we thought, and I want to give you a chance to buy books and have her sign them, and also to get some questions from you. Last question, Dambisa, is you make a very powerful argument in the book for the fact that China is that we are all in a funny way, we're certainly interconnected, and what happens with China is going to affect all of us. So my question is, what happens to the rest of us if the Chinese economy slows, which it appears to be doing right now, and China stops buying and investing globally?
So that is a very, very scary scenario, and it's a very plausible scenario. With regards to commodities, I spend a lot of time talking to policymakers across the world, in the emerging markets in particular, about this scenario, because many countries, I think, have their head in the sand. They think it's always going to be great. China is always going to be investing. One of the scenarios I put in the book, and by the way, I must confess to you that about 4 months before this book when I submitted my final manuscript, I went to China. I went to Asia. So I was in China, and then I was in Singapore, and I was at a dinner in Singapore. And somebody asked me, heard you're writing this new book. When does the book come out? And I said, in the next 6 months. And at that time, I had a purely bullish view about commodity prices, and bullish in the sense that I thought commodity prices were only going to go up. I mean, I use the term bullish. Some people would say it's actually not a good thing that commodity prices go up, and I think that's true. And the person sitting next to me said to me, well, how much time have you spent in China? I said, quite a bit, actually. I've been there many times. I travel there multiple times a year. And he said, well, there's another story brewing, which could be incredibly damaging for my thesis, but more importantly for the global economy. And the story, I won't give you the grave details, but it's all in the book. The story is that the Chinese economy, because of the problems that it's facing, whether it's their own property bubble or the slowdown in the global economy, which the Chinese were very heavily linked in through exports, because those two aspects, the property bubble and the export sector in China, were coming to a screeching halt, the problem was that China was going to slow down. And in response to that slowdown, the Chinese government is going to cut back on foreign direct investment and redirect capital towards transfers domestically at home. I went to China, went to Hong Kong, and did a bit more research on this, and that was a very, very popular thesis, quite well known. A lot of people were already putting money in cash because they were getting quite worried that the Chinese government was going to be scaling back from commodity projects. If you look, in fact, at junior miners right now, a lot of them are suffering because they're worried that the Chinese are actually not investing enough in that space. It's a long-winded way of saying it is an issue on the table. The United Nations and other development agencies say that countries have to grow at around 6%, more than 6%, in order to put a meaningful dent in poverty. China, as I said, is around 7.6 at the last print. As I also mentioned, President Hu Jintao just yesterday was talking about how he's worried about risks to the downside. I think if China goes below 6% economic growth, we have a very serious global problem. It's not implausible that that happens. I mean, that's not my base case, but it's clearly something that's on the table. I think that in many countries, particularly in the emerging markets, are ill prepared for that scenario. They have not only a lot of income coming in, and again, I'll take Zambia as an example. My country's GDP is $20 billion. I always think about the fact that people like Bill Gates are worth $53 billion. They can buy my country twice, but Zambia's $20 billion, and last year foreign direct investment was $2 billion, so 10%, $2 billion, the bulk of it was from China. So if China stops investing in Zambia, you can just imagine, just from those statistics, what the impact would be in terms of infrastructure development, in terms of job creation, and indeed, as a positive externality, some of the social programs that they're trying to avoid and getting involved in. It's not just Zambia, Turkey, Kazakhstan, and by the way, even Canada, which is very heavily linked. In fact, I was just watching something where the foreign minister in Canada, when he became the foreign minister about 2 years ago, the first thing he did was say that he's going to be focusing on China because China was their big important partner. No longer was it going to be the United States. So many countries will have a serious economic slowdown if indeed China does slow down. In fact, it's already happened to some extent, but I think to the extent that the risks are to the downside, I think we've got a big problem.
I'm going to go to the room. Just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Right here in the front row. As a matter of fact, I happen to know this is a banker about to ask you a question, so watch out. Would you please introduce yourself?
Sure, absolutely. My name is Chris Gates. Good evening. Dr. Moyo, thank you so much for doing this and spending this time with us. Winner take all. I know what that means. What I'm really interested in what winning is. In other words, it seems like in the world today, one of the issues is that we've stopped caring about each other. And when people have talked about Africa, oftentimes they've talked about the future of Africa as how we treat 12-year-old girls. So what I'd love to find out is, particularly as the Chinese work in Africa and other countries come in, how does winning seem to be taking shape, and is it purely an economic matter?
Do you want me to answer as we, or? Yeah, okay.
I think.
So, look, I don't have an answer for that because as an economist, we're trained in a very narrow way to say winning is a utility function, and the utility function has certain constraints. And so one of the things I didn't really talk about here, but there's sort of an implicit backdrop to my title, is that it is a zero-sum game. The fact that somebody's winning, that means somebody has to lose. And you can kind of see why that might be the case in commodities, because if the Chinese buy a mine in Zambia, well, I'm sorry, but nobody else has access to that mine if you really subscribe to legal ownership and access and so on. There are broader issues, though, around this. And I will tell you, actually, I was just in Zambia. I just got back last week to New York. And, excuse me, I got back yesterday to New York. But I got a similar question at an audience in Zambia. What does victory look like, so to speak? And my answer is sort of layered. First thing I would say is that we were moving away from GDP and economic measures of success or winning before the financial crisis. So people like Joe Stiglitz, former President Sarkozy in France, were looking at new measures, things like happiness and so on, which are sort of not really in the lexicon of an economist, but they were really trying to push the envelope around what sort of issue, what sort of things should we be valuing as a society. Obviously, with the financial crisis, a lot of that work has been put to one side. But one of the things I would think about, just in terms of perhaps answering that question, which I think is something I found quite interesting, is that the Chinese have been quite vocal about the fact that commodity constraints are the biggest challenge to their economic growth. They are desperately worried that they will not be able to deliver improvements simply because there's just not enough water, there's not enough copper, there's not enough energy. And a very senior Chinese policymaker said that they feel like they have two choices. The first choice is to continue to invest huge amounts in R&D and technology to try and remove those constraints. So investing in desalination, investing in new energy forms, whether it's nuclear or solar or whatever. And by the way, Beijing is the leading city now in solar panels around the world. So that's one thing that they could do. And remember that if they did that, that would be with the implicit assumption that the Western model of living at $50,000 per person is the model we should all be aspiring to. The other option is for them, the government, political class in China, to spend all its time and energy to try and convince its population that this model of everybody has 2 cars, nice holiday, big plasma screen television is not the model we should aspire to. And there's some other model, whether it's happiness or some other model, would be the model that they should aspire to as a definition of happiness. or a definition of winning. You can imagine how difficult that sell is. I mean, I was born and raised in Africa, primary, secondary school, tertiary education. And when I go home and listen to what people say, it's a very difficult sell to say to people that they should not want to have mobile phones or live like Americans. We've kind of we've bought into that model. So it's a long-winded way of saying, as I started in the beginning, I don't know what the answer is. But I think that the good news is that there are policymakers in the world today that are grappling with that issue, recognizing the fact that we are facing constraints, and perhaps the model of we should all have a large amount of GDP in a world where income inequality is so stark, recognizing that that model doesn't really exist. But I take you back to what I started off by saying very early on. The real election, I think, is not the one on November 6th. It's the one that the world is going to be facing over the next decade. When China becomes the largest economy in the world, is the rest of the world going to vote for a lack of democracy and state capitalism as the model to drive winning? Or are we going to continue to fight for a Western model of private capitalism and democracy? And to me, the onus is on the United States to make the case that even through the difficulties that we're facing right now, democracy and private capitalism are still the model that we should be aspiring to. And that's why I put the Hillary Clinton quote in here, because I think it's the wrong approach for the United States to try scaremongering in the emerging markets. Nobody has any more patience for that. It's been 50 years, lack of economic growth, poor statistics in terms of education and healthcare, and lack of delivery. You just go to Mexico and you can see what's happening there. These economies are coming to a screeching halt. The forecasts for places like Mexico and Brazil are around 1.9, 2.3. I mean, this is very slow growth. People are desperately looking for a winning solution. And if they do not believe that democracy and private capitalism are going to deliver that, and China becomes the largest economy, which I said by all accounts it will be, I think the question around what is winning may not be answered, but I think people will be moving to a different model.
Dambisa, I'm going to take three at once in interest of time.
Okay.
Gentleman here in the second row, then John Hirsch, then Peter Berezovsky in the back. Oh, here in the second row.
Thank you very much, Dambisa, for your presentation. I just want to...
Would you please introduce yourself?
My name is Hoge. I'm from the Peace Building Support Office of the United Nations. I just want to press you a little bit on your argument, which you articulated in the New York Times, Beijing, a boon to Africa, in which you implicitly rebutted Clinton's claim. Because there are two aspects to neocolonialism. There is the economic aspect, and there is the political aspect. Because in a different book, which I'm sure we have read, Martin Jack's book, When China Rules the World, Martin Jacks of the London School of Economics, he makes the point, which President Zuma also highlighted recently in Beijing, that part of the problem of China's engagement is that it's reproducing the same economic relationship insofar as it's taking out the natural resources without supporting the manufacturing sector. And one does not need to subscribe to the thesis of neocolonialism in order to explain how this will be overcome. Can you give us your thought about how, in fact, this can be addressed in order to avoid this neocolonialist trap that you so much rebutted in that article? Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, that thought. John Hirsch?
I'm also with IPI. I'm with Warren at IPI. Thank you very much. I want you to, this is like a two-part question, to clarify the comment you made about China. You didn't say it in these words, but not paying enough attention to African economies as it goes forward. That wasn't your phrase, but you had a phrase along those lines. And related to that, if you could clarify this, I presume that most of China's foreign investments are made at the state-to-state level with the leaders of the African countries on the other side of that decision-making. I mean, first of all, is that right, or if it's not right? But secondly, how qualified and prepared do you believe the African leaders who make those contractual arrangements with China are? You know, a number of years ago, I remember reading an article that there was this big summit in Beijing, and all these African leaders went up there one after another. And at least according to this article, China had this huge book on each country. It was completely ready with what it wanted from each of those countries, and it just kind of presented these African leaders at the moment, this was 8 or 9 years ago, with these ideas and sort of pushed them. And mostly they signed up without necessarily having thought about it very much. That was the thrust. So I wonder if you could comment on the knowledge base of the decision makers on both sides in these investment decisions. Thank you.
Thanks. And Peter in the back. Peter? And please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Peter Brzezowski, Consul General, Austria, here in New York. Thank you, Vice President Hoge, for another wonderful evening, and Madam for a most inspiring book. I have 3 very brief questions. Number 1, you rightly pointed out China already was a great power in the 18th, 19th, early 19th century. Tomorrow I'm going to Harvard preparing my 4-minute speech, and I will meet my friend Danny Rodrik again, who exactly pointed out this in his book, Globalization Paradox. Why is it so difficult for United States of America and Europe to understand that this phenomenon, China as a great power, has existed before, and due to many, many unfortunate events, you mentioned some of them, it came otherwise, but now they are coming back. Question number 2, you mentioned rightly so demography, rare earths, water. In how far do you think that European Union and United States of America have the right answers? And the third question, I served as a young diplomat myself in Senegal, and I'm thrilled about the fact that Africa is coming up now, also with the help of China, also with the help of US and Lomé Agreement, European Union. Do you think that it will be possible to find a balanced strategy between US, Europe, and China to really help Africa to develop in a proper way? Because I think you mentioned it before, if Africa develops, there's such an amazing potential for world economics. Do you think there will be a way out, finding a good strategy between the 3 great powers? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Warren.
What was the third great power?
Peter, the third.
The third great power? You said 3 great powers?
Sorry, US, China, and Europe.
Europe. Okay. I'm tempted to answer the last question first, just the last part C, because I think that's part of the problem, is that in looking for an answer to solve the African quote-unquote problem, a statement like what the 3 great powers should do, the US, Europe, and China, should do to solve the Africa problem, I think kind of embodies where I think the problem is. I mean, how can you try and solve a problem for a continent without asking them, the people themselves, or having them as one of the key partners of solving the problem? And I think in just addressing these questions, I think that's the overarching point and problem, I think, of the issue. And I'll come back to it again in the end. The first question was around this idea of neocolonialism. Now, maybe I take your point that there are people who define neocolonialism to be economic and political. My first point is that my understanding of the term colonialism is largely a political construct and less of an economic one. The economics is a tool, and it certainly is extraction of minerals. And if you're saying, is there an extraction of minerals out of Africa or out of these countries? Yes, there is. But to me, I do not believe that that is colonialism or neocolonialism, because if you look back historically at the colonization of Africa, you had the arrival of the missionaries who were there for religious purposes. You had the, shall we call them, the business arm industrialists. I don't know what you would call them back in that day, but whether it was sort of the Cecil Rhodes, later on, Tiny Rowland type of person. And then you had what I would call the colonialists, which are the people who came in for political infrastructure. Now, you could argue that this troika had to work together for this thing to work, But my understanding, when the Secretary of State of the United States stands up and says you should be worried about neocolonialism, surely she's not referring to the risk of minerals being extracted from Africa. We are selling those minerals, so obviously we know that. Why would she suggest that we should be worried about something that is a known fact? My interpretation of that cautionary remark that we should be worried about neocolonialism is about the risks of the African population being subjugated in a political framework. And it is that I think is incorrect, because as far as I'm concerned, the Chinese have absolutely no interest whatsoever. They may, maybe in 3050, they'll care about settling in Africa and taking over the governments. But if anything, the problem is on the other side. They really don't care about that. And the question then becomes, what do African governments do with the knowledge that these scarce and depleting and finite resources, once they come to a screeching halt, the Chinese will leave? I think that's what they should be worried about, not about the Chinese setting up shop and building a new civil service and a society in Africa and subjugating the African people. And I think, going back to what I was saying a moment ago, I think it's a great pity that it's that type of emotive language that the US is using. The United States knows that Africa needs investment desperately. And if the United States really cares about Africa, they should actually start to engage with Africans as equal partners. They need to invest on the African continent and not just write checks out of pity. When Secretary Clinton stands up and says there are concerns about neocolonialism, somebody like Bill Gates is not going to get all excited and enthusiastic about going to invest in Africa. It's that type of language, I think, that sets the stage. In fact, I know sets the stage for the business community in the United States, and this is a great disservice to the African continent. I don't know whether some people would call it sour grapes, that maybe the United States has been back-footed in this case, and therefore is trying to fight back and claw back by trying to undermine the Chinese efforts. But I think it really is a fundamental problem for them to use this scaremongering around neocolonialism. I rest very easy knowing that the Chinese really don't care about the political infrastructure. If I can just say a little bit more about this, because it's not that I think that the Chinese should run roughshod across Africa, or indeed anywhere around the world. When the Chinese invest in the United States, nobody is worried about neocolonialism. Nobody's worried about labor laws being flouted. Nobody's worried about environmental concerns. They're not worried about that either in Canada or Brazil and these other places. And that, to me, is about the accountability and the strength of the government. And it comes to a question that was here about knowledge as well. I think it's partly about knowledge. I wouldn't say that every African leader that I've met has been the sharpest tool in the shed. But I would say that we are now 50 years, in some cases more than 50 years, after independence. I think it is a great shame that we can sit here in 2012 and query and wonder whether there's a knowledge base that can have a discussion about the value of resources in these countries. What have we been doing for 50 years? I will also say, I can say this now because I had a meeting in 2010 with Dominic Strauss-Kahn when he was the head of the IMF. And I was so disappointed that he did not chase me around the table. And I say that only in jest, because when I found out that he actually has a predilection for African women, I thought that at least I would have been chased around the table, but I was not, I will say. But he did say something in that meeting that I have to tell you, as an African, was probably the most disheartening thing I've ever heard, which was that out of around 50 countries in Africa, and this is 2010, so 2 years ago, out of around 50 countries in Africa, there are only 2 countries that the IMF felt comfortable dealing with the government, that the government would be able to write a report on any of the key public sector areas, healthcare, education, for example. In every other country, so to call it 52 countries, these international agencies did not feel comfortable. And he was saying it actually with a point of concern, but as an African, I was incredibly crushed. Here we were 50 years plus, for some countries, after independence, and what progress have we made? You know, people can say, oh yeah, you know, we've been putting all this money into Africa, we're doing a great job. What progress have we made if we are not able to have policymakers in place that are able to have a conversation about the assets, valuing the assets, or not even able to find people who can advise them correctly on this? I think this is damning. It's also damning for the democratic process. I mean, what is democracy? It's a contract. There's an implicit contract between individuals and their governments. How do you live in the United States? United States, you're an individual. The government says, we're going to tax you. And you say, fine, Mr. President, tax me, but in return, I expect a suite of public goods. I expect education. I expect healthcare. Well, healthcare is a small question mark. I expect infrastructure. I expect national security. If your president doesn't deliver on that, what do? You vote them out. That is the democratic contract. And in Africa, what has happened for 50 years plus, that contract has been severed because African governments have not spent time listening to what their populations want. They have very rationally, and it's very important because it's very rational behavior, spent their time courting and catering international donors. And those donors have allowed and by the way, it's not just the donors, it's also the people in these developed economies. They have allowed African governments to run roughshod over their populations. We should be ashamed that we're living in 2012 and we're not sure whether or not there's a knowledge base. When are we going to have a knowledge base if it's not 50 years later with all the amount of money that's gone into Africa? I'm not skirting your question, but if you're asking me, do I think that there is a knowledge base, I think that my greatest concern is that the knowledge base that does exist, because there are numerous brilliant Africans, they're doctors, teachers, engineers all around the world. My problem is that they are not being attracted to being the civil servants in these countries. And the question is, why is that the case? And I would say that the majority of those people have absolutely no interest in being involved in what I would call the biggest racket to occur in the past 50 years, where governments are rewarded. And by the way, this is a statement from an African president. He said, you have to understand, we are rewarded for underperformance of our countries. The more poverty, the more disease we can show, the more money we get, the less work we have to do. I mean, it's twisted. But I do believe the knowledge base exists. I just think that it's so fragmented, and they really do not want to be a party to this horrendous system that has occurred. I'm veering off slightly, but I've got here China not paying enough attention to African economies. I think that's part of the same point. I think that the point here, my point was not that China is not paying enough attention. My point is, like any investor, because people are focused on the Chinese right now, but for the past 50 years, China's been nowhere in these economies. This is a decade-long issue. Yes, the Chinese built the Tazara railways back in the 50s, but for 40 years, they were nowhere, right? I mean, they were gone. They were struggling with their own economy. They've come back in the past 10 years. So Europe and the United States have had multiple decades to actually go into Africa and play fair. But we have a catalog, and you only have to look at the EITI, the Extraction Industries Transparency International, or Transparency International itself. The issues around corruption, issues around the failure of state have occurred when China was nowhere, was not involved. It's not to give China a free pass. It's to simply say that to the extent that we expect there to be better outcomes, we cannot expect China as the investor to sort of volunteer itself. And I think it's a waste of time, or it's a misapplication of great resources to point fingers at China and almost scare them out of the African continent. Instead, we should use those energies to highlight the inadequacies and the failures of the governments. Because the governments that have been, many of them have been in power over 20 years and have done nothing for the improvement of their populations, those are the governments that we should say are completely unacceptable. If you want to provide aid and support, which is very welcome, provide that aid and support to governments that actually are doing something to improve the livelihoods of their countries. Do not provide aid to governments that are doing nothing. Do not allow a situation where HIV/AIDS is actually completely supported, the infrastructure around HIV/AIDS is completely supported by an outside agency. I mean, that to me is a neocolonialism of sorts. Well, it is. No, but I'll tell you, I mean, my last point on this, and then I'll do the last few questions, is, I remember going on a book tour in Kenya, and somebody said to me, if you live in Africa, infrastructure is provided by the Chinese. The UN provides national security. The United States, through the PEPFAR program, is providing HIV drugs. Education is provided by DFID, or one of the Scandinavian agencies. Then what is it that the African governments are supposed to do? And how are we supposed to hold them accountable for their failures? That in of itself is a failure, that the governments have completely parceled out these responsibilities. And the more fundamental question this Kenyan woman said, which asked me, she was part being facetious, but she's quite right. She's like, well, if democracy is about holding to account the provision of these public goods, why are we wasting our time focusing on these governments that are basically not doing anything? We should be voting between Bill Gates Foundation and the Global Fund. Who better provides healthcare? I mean, it's partly being facetious, but in a way, it's quite a real thing. So it is about the governments in Africa. What can we do? And that was what the essence of that article was. Stop pointing fingers at China. Stop screaming at China. Focus on the more important issue, which is the failure of African governments to do their jobs in a proper way. Labor issues are responsibility of the African governments. When we say, how can they have all these Chinese in Africa, who let them in? Who gave them the visas? The African governments have to be held to account. Environmental concerns, African governments have to be held to account. It is not good enough for us to wait for somebody to come on a white pony to save us because somehow we think that the Chinese are the bad people. It's not the Chinese fault, it's the African governments that have to be held accountable. Why is it, just for these last couple of questions, why is it difficult for the United States to understand what China's doing? Was that the question? Oh, yes. I think it's, the situation was exactly the same for the Chinese at the time of their decline. I think it's very difficult to understand not only how the world is changing, but what your role is in the changing world. And I know in the United States, they're quite fixated, US policymakers are quite fixated on getting the rest of the world to conform to the US model. But almost no time is being spent on a possibility that we might actually conform to the Chinese model when China becomes the largest economy. And I think that's where the problem is. I think that the attitude, I don't think it's a lack of recognition. I think there is a recognition that the world is changing. But I think that the problem, I would say, is that the approach, the attitude to that change is the wrong one. The scaremongering in Africa, the negative commentary around China, if China is successful, they must be cheating on their exchange rate. Then nobody ever talks about subsidy programs that have decimated African agriculture markets. That's okay. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that a lot of the problems that the United States is facing today are homegrown. It's not because of China that Americans have stopped going to school. China has nothing to do with that. When Americans come to Africa, they talk about education being a key pillar of economic success, but you're failing to educate your own youth. That's got nothing to do with China. And yet China is viewed as this lightning rod of negativity. So I think I would say it's not a lack of understanding or difficulty. I think the difficulty is standing up and saying, look, this country has got issues, China has issues, but we have to befriend them in order to solve these problems. I think they feel like it's easier to antagonize them. So whether it's the blind gentleman the activist, one of the things that the Chinese always say to me not always, but a number of Chinese have said to me when I've been there is, here we are, we've moved 300 million people out of poverty in 30 years. Something that has never been done in the history of the world. And who gets the Nobel Prize? It's always the dissident. It's always the person who's anti-government in China. There's no positive recognition, it would seem, of what they've done. And I think they're on to something. I'm not saying that the Chinese are perfect. They've got a lot of issues, but we never give them any credit for any of the positive things that they're doing around the world. And that, to me, is a big problem because the more we embarrass them, the more we keep them in a particular, we accuse them of doing things rightly or wrongly, the more we create the schism that I think longer term will be incredibly damaging for how the world works. I'm conscious, I see you looking at your time. The last couple of things here, I think was, you had said something about demography and water. Yeah, so, I mean, I think I've kind of answered it. I think I've kind of answered that. I think that the question of political infrastructure will be secondary to what are you improving people's livelihoods. Democracy is something we should all aspire to, but as an economist, unsurprisingly perhaps, I would say you need the economics first. You get the economics right, you get the middle class, and they are the ones who are able to hold the governments accountable. And I'm not saying that there necessarily has to be sequencing, but I think one of the problems that we've had is that we've spent a lot of time focusing on putting in democracy, but the majority of democracies in the world are illiberal. Is Russia a democracy? It is on paper, but the places where journalists are killed, women are not given equal suffrage. Those are the countries that we're engaging with as ostensible democracies, but they're not democracies. If you want to have a proper democracy, I think you have to get the economics right first.
Piece of public housekeeping. We normally do this till 8 o'clock.
Okay.
You have an 8 o'clock commitment.
I do.
I also want to give you a chance to sign some books. So it's now 12 minutes to 8. What should we do? And you see the amount of interest. I hate to cut it off.
I'll tell you what, why don't we, how about I do one more round of questions? Is that okay?
Right.
And then we can see where we go.
1, 2, 3.
Hi, my name is Fabiola Stevens. I work at the Permanent Mission of Canada. I would like first to thank you and IPI for being so open throughout your recent public history. It's quite refreshing. First question, I'd like for you to comment on Niall Ferguson's thesis of Chimerica. You present it as in two parts. He presents it as a codependent sibling rivalry. And I'd like to have your comments on that. And second question, I'd like to have your opinion on food security in Africa and the links to human security, and how the different approach of agricultural impact China is having compared to the Western model. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chimerica was also on my list of things to ask her about, so thank you. What was the second? There you are.
Hi, my name's Abby Soma. I'm working with UNDP. So I have a question. If I'm an American with $100 that I want to support an African country, what's the best way do you think that I should do it? Is it a scholarship, microfinance? Do I buy an African product? Americans have a tradition of philanthropy, so how do you think that they should respond?
Good question. Good. Did you? I was going to.
It's as the Chinese, it's very interesting for me to, it's really interesting night for me to hear the thoughts from the author and the audiences. Actually, I just have some quick thoughts to share. When I was looking at the issue, I was kind of thinking the drive of the commodity consumption is a accumulated kind of consumption from the world that goes to China, because when you look at all those factories and the made in China products we enjoy all over the world, China is actually taking the cost of all the consumption from the world. So when I see actually, let's say water in China, it actually costs a lot for the residents to pay for water, but here it's free, and there's a lot of waste here, and it's a lot of waste of commodities, paper, and everything here. And whenever I see them, I'm like, wow, that costs a lot from the sweatshops in China to pay for all those things. And I think there's a big need for instance, social, corporate social responsibilities. Because when I was doing the research on the case of Mattel, the toy companies that got the toys that kind of, not qualified to sell here, I find there are a lot of, foreign companies, they don't have this as corporate social responsibility when they invest in China. And for instance, the luxury marketing, that's how they picture what kind of lifestyle you need to have. So all those luxury products cost, a lot of resources, and they're all nowadays made in China. So I see how can we educate the whole world to, save consumptions and, and then actually transfer to China and to a lot of developing countries. And I agree with your point that the governments should take responsibilities. For instance, China, on one hand, they're trying to get more resources. On the other hand, they export their best resources to other countries that are paying more. So I think that's a big topic to
I think
focus.
I meant to recognize that. Just give him the microphone, and then very fast, please, and then we'll.
Yeah, two things and very quick question. Jake Bright, contributing writer for several outlets, including Bloomberg and Africa.com. And I've been speaking to people on this topic for the last several years, including interviewing Dambisa for Debt Aid. And most of the people I speak to have gotten over the neo-colonialist framing and speak about the Chinese-African relationship more of one as strategic partnership. Africa, wants jobs and infrastructure development. China is looking for resources. So the question is, what's in this for Africa? And you've alluded to some of this, but what is in this strategic partnership for Africa? How does Africa make sure it's getting the most out of it for its people and for its economic and social development?
Okay. This will be the end. And any of you, while we're talking, the books are for sale out there. And go ahead. It's now 10 of 8.
Okay. So Chimerica, I think that that thesis clearly, oh, she disappeared. Oh, yeah, you are. Sorry, you put your jacket on. Sorry, sweater. I think that was a very compelling thesis a few years ago in particular. And I wouldn't say it's zero, but obviously to the extent that China has been very vocal about moving away from export-led economic growth towards more domestic demand, I think the catalyst of the financial crisis means that that is a bigger pillar of their strategy. I think means that the codependency issue will be challenged. I don't think we live in a global world, and so I say that not in a deliberately banal or trite way. It therefore means that China will be engaged with the United States. I just think that my concern is how they will be engaged, because I still think that a lot of the commentary and the manner in which the United States talks to China or deals with China in public, so in private it might be very different, but in public still is laced with a "they're not our peers" kind of way. So you say codependent. Codependency kind of has a sense of equals. I don't think that Americans view the Chinese as their equals. And I think that's where there's a lot of room for growth. I think it's very important because you don't want to piss off the Chinese, particularly if they become the biggest economy in the world. Food security and human security, obviously inextricably linked. I think it's completely insane that, but also understandable, that Africa with untilled arable land, the most untilled arable land left in the world, is unable to feed itself. And I think it's a whole list of reasons, but I think one of the biggest casualties, or one of the biggest tragedies, I should say, has been the food subsidy programs. You can't on the one hand claim that you believe in free markets and trade, and on the other hand will not allow Africa to sell primary produce into Europe and the United States. I think that is absolutely unfair. It really is. And it's decimated people's livelihoods. I mean, numerous farmers, hundreds of millions of people have been affected by this. Healthcare budgets have been affected by this. We cannot be peers if we can't feed ourselves. So it's inextricably linked. I think that the risks of conflict and so on are very much linked to and human security are very much linked to food security. In the 1990s, Africa had more conflicts than the rest of the world put together. Thankfully, that's come down quite a lot, but it's still a big issue. What do you do with $100? Well, my personal first answer would be use it to write or call your congressman and tell them to open the American market so that Africans can sell their produce here. However, I also live in in the real world, so I know that you are, because you're American and have a great philanthropic heart, are looking for something you could do. The things that I like are things like Kiva, which is an investment platform where you can actually lend to not just Africans, anyone around the world, for them to invest in their businesses. I think that that is a much more innovative thing than rather than just handing out cash and perpetuating some of the problems, structural problems that I've talked about in the past. Ultimately, it's up to you to decide. I think what you're looking for is a higher return, a higher value add type of proposition. And I think that, $100, you send it for a girl to go to school. That's great, might make you feel better, but the fact of the matter is that over time, these economies have simply not been growing fast enough for this girl to have a job when she comes out in years time. So I'm the kind of person who tries to move the needle more dramatically, but it's not to say that you don't have a role. Everybody has a role. And I actually, in my book, Dead Aid, I said that ultimately the people who have the biggest swing vote, if we can call it that, are people in developed economies. Your leaders listen to you. So if you write to your congressman, if you make a big hoo-ha about these issues, they will listen to you. My president or my African leaders, many African leaders are unlikely to listen, even if they know that the aid system, for example, or the Chinese running roughshod is a bad thing. They are unlikely to listen to me. So I think that you're on to the right thing. I think about investment. Think about what you would want people to do for you if you were in that situation. You would want people to bet on you, to invest in you, not just to feel sorry for you. My best friend is sitting right here in the third row. She ran the largest HIV program in Zambia. I don't think it's a crime for me to say that they received. Are you shaking your head? Okay, so I guess I've given she's a lawyer also, so we'll be okay. She ran the largest HIV program in Zambia. And Zambia, as you know, has large HIV AIDS problems. And I will say two things that she told me. First of all, she resigned from the program, and I was very upset. I said, you're exactly the person that needs to stay in there and fight for our country. And she said to me, and I hope she doesn't get thrown out of our country for this, but she did say, Dambisa, the problem is your government doesn't care about its own people. Its own people. The president does not care. The government does not care about its own people. And Zambia is one of the countries that is heavily dependent on foreign assistance for the health care sector. It's to the point that the government doesn't do anything about it. Specifically about the Gates Foundation, they gave her organization a very large check to help in HIV/AIDS. If I remember the dates correctly, I don't remember the amount. I think it was about $6 million. Yeah, $6 million. And they never, well, at the time she was telling me the story, it must have been 4 or 5 years afterwards, and they had not gone back to find out what had happened to the money. And the exact words of my friend were, for all they know, I could be sitting in Tahiti. And coming back to the damning nature of aid is that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation could write a check for $6 million and not go back to find out what happened to that money. And so I'm not sitting here, to damn the programs. I think that people have a lot of good intentions, but ultimately it's about execution. And if it's badly executed, the impact on these economies is incredibly damning. And I think that people do have good intentions, but I think that there are better things, more efficient things that they can do to try and help these economies. So, excuse me. Corporate social responsibility, I wasn't too sure if it was a comment rather than a question, but let me say this about Africa, and I think this leads into the last question about Africa and China. There's clearly a China policy towards Africa, clearly. They've hosted African leaders, they've been very explicit, public about what their goals and their plans are for the African continent. It's also pretty clear that there's no African strategy vis-a-vis China. I think it's quite fragmented, and I've talked a lot about the need for Africa to be much more regionally integrated. My country, as I've said, 13 million people, who cares? It's part of Southern Africa, it's 250 million people. Well, now that's a more compelling story in terms of markets and engagement. I think that if you look at the Africa problem, and this is one of the reasons I wrote my first book, because we kind of know, after 300 years of Western civilization, Western economies, I should say, we know actually what works. We know that countries that trade more do better than countries that don't trade. We know that countries that attract foreign direct investment do better than countries that don't attract foreign direct investment. I can give you North Korea and Cuba as examples of countries that don't trade and they don't have foreign direct investment as extremes. But Africa today, with 1 billion people, 15% of the world's population, is less than 2% of world trade, and it's less than 2% of foreign direct investment. And remember what I said, we are the largest amount of untilled arable land. We should be able to feed ourselves and feed the world, and we're not doing that. And I'm not going to go into the whole host of reasons why it has got to this place, this horrendous place. But I think that the Chinese approach to Africa is closer to the approach of economics that the rest of the world has been following. That the policy or the group of policies that has actually delivered economic growth and reduced poverty. There's no country in the history of the world that has achieved economic growth and reduced poverty in a sustainable way by relying on aid. Not one. Countries that have received aid, these aid graduate countries, have received aid as a short, sharp, finite injection, like the Europeans did with the Marshall Plan. But we've always known that trade is important. We've known foreign direct investment is important. And yet, those are the key policies that are not encouraged or engaged with in terms of Africa. And so, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question directly, but my point is to say that coming back to this big election that we are going to be facing, whether we continue with the US model or go with the Chinese model, a very key element of that is, for Africa, is who is willing to trade with us? Who is willing to engage with us as equal partners? Who is willing to help us create jobs when we've got so many young people? And I really hope the United States takes more of an aggressive stance in that regard. But as it stands right now, they haven't. And I think it's to the detriment of not just Africa, but the detriment of the world. And I really do hope that the story will change over the next decade.
Dambisa, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.